Hello, and welcome to Oxford University Linguistics Society's third event for Trinity Term 2021. We're here with Professor Richard Kayne, who's at NYU. His work is on syntax, and particularly French and Italian syntax, but we're going to be talking today about linearization. Professor Kayne, it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
If we can jump in with the questions. Recently, a number of linguists, including Noam Chomsky, have argued that linear order isn't necessarily a part of core syntax, that the syntax can't make reference to it. Do you think that's so? And if not, what's wrong with the arguments?
Going back at least as far as my anti-symmetry monograph in 1994, I've taken linear order to be an integral part of core syntax. I've never been sympathetic to the idea that it comes in only afterwards, on the way to PF, so to speak. Obviously, there are other people who take the opposite position. It's interesting historically to think back to the first 15 or so years of generative syntax, when it was taken for granted that linear order was part of core syntax. Only beginning with remarks on nominalization, Chomsky's paper, that the idea began to grow that you could factor linear order out of the hierarchical structure.
Why? What's the motivation? What's wrong with the specific arguments often provided for it that you don't get linearizing rules and that sort of thing?
Well, on the one hand, I've thought for a while, and I've specifically argued for this in a couple of relatively recent papers, that on the assumption that antisymmetry is basically correct, you can make more sense of the fact that it is correct if you take linear order to be part of core syntax than if you don't. Or putting it another way, if linear order comes in only on the way to PF, and you ask, why should it be antisymmetric? I don't think you have any hope of getting an answer, an interesting answer. At the same time, I've never been convinced that anywhere near as much takes place on the way from syntax to PF as many people think. I've never even been convinced of the correctness of the idea that if something has no effect on semantic interpretation, it must not be in the core syntax. Well, that's a commonly taken position.
Thank you for that. Like Mal says, it's great to have you here. It's always really interesting for us to hear lots of different information. So you've mentioned antisymmetry in your paper from 1994. Could you explain a little bit more, what does it mean to say that syntax is antisymmetric?
Well, in the technical terms of the 1994 monograph, it meant that what I called the linear correspondence axiom back then was correct, in the sense that it was correct to take it to be an axiom of language faculty. More specifically, but still in technical terms, it meant that syntactic structure always mapped to linear order in spec head complement order. No exceptions at any stage of the derivation in any language. But there's a sense in which you can think of antisymmetry in a more informal way and take the intuition to be that if you have a given syntactic structure hierarchically represented with linear order attached to it in some, and if it's appropriate for some sentence in some language, then antisymmetry says that the mirror image of that structure with linear order is necessarily impossible in all languages. Or put another way, you never get mirror image pairs in the language faculty. The language faculty turns its back on the possibility of mirror image pairs. And of course, more specifically, again, this leads to all sorts of expectations about how syntax works, especially if you bring in the idea that was in the monograph that there's no real difference between specifiers and adjuncts. Because if that's true, it means that adjuncts are always to the left of their associated head. And another aspect of it is the idea that you can't have more than one spec associated with one head. That idea feeds in pretty directly to cartography, which takes that position in a strong way.
So, do you think the cartographic approach sort of goes hand in glove with anti-symmetry then, that we need these non-lexical projections?
Definitely. I mean, the idea that there's only one spec per head is probably accepted by a moderately wide fraction of syntacticians. Cartography, of course, has other aspects to it that are less closely connected to anti-symmetry. I mean, the cartographic idea that you have the same skeletal structure in every language is not directly tied to anti-symmetry. It's in a way related in part, at least, to Mark Baker's Utah hypothesis, which says that, for a given, that languages don't randomly change syntactic configurations for the fun of it. If you have a constant interpretation, then you've got the same syntactic structure in language after language. That's an important hypothesis, which I am sympathetic to.
So you've recently talked about treating the LCA as not an axiom, but a theorem.
Yes.
Why, and what's the difference? What would this entail?
Well, the difference is basically that to take it to be an axiom, as I did in 1994, is to take it to be something that cannot be explained any further. It's to say that it makes no sense to ask why it holds. It's an axiom, and that's it. In recent years, I've tried to go beyond that, and I tried to ask why the language faculty would have the property expressed by the LCA, the anti-symmetry, because you can obviously, and in fact, everybody assumed, especially in the 1980s, that there was no anti-symmetry at all, that you had a head complement parameter or a head spec parameter, and either value was possible, and so there was no close connection between hierarchical structure and linear order. That's obviously logically possible, and in addition, it's obviously plausible since so many people took that position. Therefore, it seemed to me in recent years that it's legitimate to ask and interesting to ask why syntax should be anti-symmetric if it in fact is. And I tried in a couple of relatively recent papers to to give an account of that basically using the idea that linear order comes in directly with merge. That was, of course, something that I couldn't have had that idea in the 1994 monograph, because that monograph was essentially written before minimalism came into being.
So why do we get precedence? What's the rough outline of why we get precedence mapping to asymmetric sequence?
Well, that gets a bit complex and a bit technical. In these recent papers, I broke that down into two steps, a bit like I had it in the monograph. One step was to show that for a given head, specifier and complement had to be on opposite sides of the head. And then a second step was to show that in choosing between specifier head complement order and complement head specifier order, both of which respect that initial conclusion, the language faculty actually has picked specifier head complement order in a way that in the most recent of these papers, I tried to connect to the probing aspect of minimalism. In the 1994 monograph, there was a related idea having to do with time slots. But it's interesting to think that the choice between spec head complement order and complement head spec order is actually independent of antisymmetry, since both orders, if imposed systematically, respect antisymmetry.
Thank you. So I suppose just leading on from that, or probing a little deeper there, so could you explain a little bit more as to why it is spec head complement and how this would work, or does this work for languages like Japanese?
Well, it works in the set that is the antisymmetry claim simply says that every language has to respect spec head complement order. Now, if you look at a language like Japanese and you look at it very quickly, you have the impression that, you have the fact that you have, in general, object-verb order. And it's very easy to jump from that to the conclusion that Japanese has complement head order in the case of object-verb order. But the jump is not justified. All that OV order in Japanese tells us is that the object sort of canonically precedes the verb. But in doing syntax, we have to ask, well, where exactly is that object? If it's in the specifier of the verb, if it's in the complement position of the verb, then obviously that violates antisymmetry. So the conclusion that antisymmetry draws is that the object in Japanese is not in the complement position of the verb. Now, the simplest, certainly, way to think about that is to think that it's in some higher specifier position, conceivably in the specifier position of the verb, in a way that would recall aspects of Richard Larson's paper on VP shells in the late 80s, where he had, at least in cases like put the book on the table, the book was in the specifier position of the initial position of the verb. So Larson's work was a an interesting precursor to certain aspects of antisymmetry. In addition, not only for that reason that I just mentioned, but also because he was the first person to propose that you could reinterpret and should reinterpret heavy NP shift in terms of leftward movement. So that was a very interesting step in the direction of antisymmetry, which ended up with the idea that all movement is necessarily leftward. But to come back to Japanese, I think that something that's important in syntax in general, I mean, we all know this, but it's hard to keep it consistently in mind, is that there's no point, is that the aim of syntactic theory, well, linguistic theory more generally, but of syntactic theory in particular, is not to study the syntax of one language. And it's not even to study the syntax of many languages one after the other. It's rather to study the syntax of all languages at the same time, which of course is an impossible task. But setting that minor problem aside, and getting back to the OV question, if we look at the question of OV languages in a very general way, we see a number of things which really reduce the plausibility of thinking that Japanese OV is showing us complement verb order. For one thing, it's very clear that there are various languages in which the object of a verb must raise fairly high and can conceivably be understood as being in the complement position of the verb. One such pair of languages is Dutch and German. In the very interesting case that's called the IPP construction, where you get the order object auxiliary verb verb, or object auxiliary verb. In that particular kind of sentence, it's completely clear that a simple OV equals complement head can't possibly be correct. In addition, there are many languages, in particular in West Africa, in which you frequently or systematically have subject, aux, object, verb, but only in certain cases. So you clearly have alternations of a sort that would lead you readily to think in terms of movement. In addition, there are languages in which, and this goes back to a paper by John Whitman, there are languages where objects normally precede negation. Again, that can't possibly be an object sitting in, in other words, you have object negation verb. In cases like that, whether in languages that systematically have that or in languages that sometimes have that, those are clear cases in which the object is not in the complement position of the verb. Now, if you add this all up, it makes it plausible, if not very plausible, to think that objects are never, that objects are invariably raised. It doesn't follow from the things that I just said, but it seems to me quite plausible. And in fact, it was basically proposed, maybe, I don't remember, maybe it was Chomsky who first suggested this in the 80s, at the time when Agar-O began to be talked about. I mean, one way to think of it is that in the history of generative syntax, movement of the subject has grown gradually. At the very beginning, superficial subjects got there by movement in passives, superficial subjects. But at the very beginning, superficial subjects of, say, transitive verbs did not get there into superficial subject position by movement. However, let's say starting in the 80s, that became a widely accepted hypothesis. That is the subject within VP hypothesis, or nowadays subject within little VP, or within voice phrase or whatever, but the idea is now widely accepted that subjects are not externally merged in spec of TP or a position like that. So we've essentially reached, also in part through the unaccusative hypothesis, the idea that superficial subject position is always filled by movement. And people began thinking, starting in the 80s, that the same thing might be true of objects. That the surface position, surface meaning the derivation final position of an object, might always reflect movement of one kind or another. And I actually argued for that position even for prepositional objects. In a paper called Prepositions as Probes, I tried to argue that you could take objects of at least certain prepositions, like the dative "a" of languages like Romance languages, to be, you might take the position that the preposition and what we think of as its object are not actually merged with each other. Rather, the preposition comes in somewhere in the sentential hierarchy and attracts what we think of as its object. So, and that's certainly not true. It's certainly not true that all prepositions act the same way, but it seems to me increasingly plausible that at least in the case of arguments, DPs of one sort or another, that derivation finally, we never see them in their external merged position. That is, every argument moves at least once, perhaps for case-related reasons or perhaps for other reasons. If something like that is true, it means the kind of reasoning that says Japanese OV equals complement head simply disappears. You can't make use of that kind of reasoning at all.
So is the theory of movement being assumed here still copy theory sort of thing, where with the, how do you decide which, if so, is the decision for which copy is pronounced, is that still a phonetic form condition?
Well, that's a rather different kind of question. I'm relatively sympathetic to the copy theory of movement. It seems to me the key question is, a key question is in those cases in which we see something multiple times in one sentence that really just corresponds to one thing, like certain cases of WH movement where you get in some dialects, who do you think who left first? Or in Romance language, in certain Romance languages, you get things like John, it wants to read it. If those cases of multiple occurrence of what seems to be one thing reflect the copy theory of movement, that is, if those are really cases in which you're pronouncing both the head and the tail of the chain, then that's good reason to think that the copy theory of movement is correct. Obviously, there are problems, and they've been discussed by people like Jairo Nunes and others. The simple formulation is that if the copy theory of movement is correct, why don't you get systematic pronunciation of more than one copy? And obviously you don't. And does the copy theory of movement help us to understand the difference between those cases in which you sometimes do see two copies and those cases, like say passive, in which apparently you never see two copies? So, John was arrested. John seems not to be attested anywhere. But if the copy theory of movement is correct, then your question comes to the fore. how do you know which copy to pronounce? I'm not entirely sympathetic to the idea that there exist cases in which you only pronounce a lower copy. But that's, I'm not sure what the right answer is. In fact, I'm not sure that the copy theory of movement is correct. It seems to me that if you go back to the early motivation for it, that in terms of the notion of reconstruction, there's an alternative view that's occasionally been put forth, and it's hard to work out. And that's the view that if you have a maximally derivational theory, there shouldn't be any notion of reconstruction at all, other than the notion that in certain cases, you do certain kinds of interpretation early in the derivation prior to movement. Now, if you could, if it were possible to execute that idea in a satisfactory way, you wouldn't really need copies anymore for the purposes of interpretation. So you're left still with the case of visible copies in these cases like who do you think who left? And there, it's maybe you need the copy theory of movement. I don't know. Maybe.
Thank you for that. So this links back a little bit to what we were talking about before with the spec head comp situation. What can be said under your view about the structure of language with very free word order languages like Walpre? How would we apply such a theory?
To my eye, languages of that sort differ from languages like English in that they have more, they sort of canonically have more instances of movement than English does. It seems to me that, I mean, that's a sort of vague answer because it doesn't say what kinds of movement or when they take place, et cetera. But it seems to me to be the answer. I mean, we don't have to go to that far afield to ask this question. Well, for one thing that was very interesting was the doctoral dissertation by Anders Holmberg, where he compared Swedish and Icelandic, and against the background of the idea that rich case morphology will allow lots of freedom of word order. Icelandic has far richer case morphology than Swedish does, Swedish being pretty much like English, and Icelandic having more than German. But what he found was that the extra freedom of word order that Icelandic has was not zero, but it was much smaller than you might expect. So that's one angle on this. Another is just that if you take, say, you take a language like Russian, which clearly has more freedom of word order than English, yet is relatively closely related to English. Where does that extra freedom of word order come from? I don't know the answer. I mean, you might say it's the case morphology of Russian that we lack. But Holmberg's argument shows that that can't possibly be the whole story. And then, of course, within Slavic, you could try to transpose Holmberg's discussion into Slavic and say, compare the word order of Russian with the word order of Bulgarian. Bulgarian having appreciably less case morphology. I don't know what comes out of that, but anyhow, so the general answer to your question is that, I think in terms of extra movement possibilities.
So you mentioned the head parameter earlier. Is that under this view, eliminated? And what are the consequences for acquisition?
Well, there's certainly no head parameter in the sense in which the term was understood in the, say, the 1980s. Since if antisymmetry is correct, you always have spec head complement with no options. The question remains, of course, how do we distinguish, let's say oversimplifying, how do we distinguish VO languages from OV languages? Part of the simplification is that, as we know, let's say from Matthew Pearson's work, there's no consistent notion of VO language, because he argued that in a language like Malagasy, which is VO in the standard Greenbergian sense, the syntax as a whole is quite different from the syntax of a VO language like English. And I imagine that the same is true of OV languages. There's really, we can take OV to be a useful introductory term, but we should expect that the notion OV covers a wide range of languages quite different from one another. For example, the term is used for Dutch and German and for Japanese, but that's absurd. They have one thing in common, but overall the syntax is radically different. And then you have languages like the West African ones that I mentioned in passing, where you get systematic alternations between VO and OV depending on aspects. I haven't answered the question, how do you distinguish Japanese from English? I think part of the answer is that you have to interpret that question as a question about the fact that a language like Japanese has the property that objects of verbs will systematically end up at the end of the derivation preceding the verb, not necessarily immediately preceding it, but preceding it. Whereas in a language like English, in the general case, setting aside all sorts of exceptions, the object of verb will, derivation finally, follow the verb. Now, that essentially leaves open, completely open, the question of what the derivations look like. So all we can say is that in Japanese, it may be that the verb moves a certain amount, may be that the object moves a certain amount. Whatever those amounts, the object has to end up further to the left than the verb. And in English, it's the opposite with respect to ending up. So that leaves us a lot of work in trying to understand what exactly these movements are cross-linguistically.
And if I could quickly ask just about flat structure, especially with languages like Warlberry, that sort of analysis for those languages would be quite antithetical to antisymmetry then?
Well, actually, yes and no. If you took the position that in a language like Warlberry, you had flat structure, but you stuck to spec head complement order, but it was flat, as opposed to English-like languages where you had spec head complement order that was not flat, there would be a specific way in which you were respecting antisymmetry despite endorsing the notion of flat structure. And actually, in one of these recent papers on antisymmetry, I consider the possibility, not exactly a flat structure in the sense in which people have used it, but I considered the possibility that after you merge head and complement, when you merge the spec, whatever phrase is going to be the spec, you don't actually merge it with the phrase consisting of head plus complement, you actually merge it with just the head, giving you not exactly a flat structure in the standard sense, but giving you an unfamiliar kind of structure. On the other, another aspect of this is that, I mean, flat structure violates binary branching, which is a somewhat different kind of question. What I think is what I think one really wants to say is that it seems to me inconceivable. Well, I mean, that's stating it too strongly. It seems to me implausible that languages would differ in some having flat structure and others not. That kind of parametric difference seems implausible. It's a bit like thinking of the possibility that languages might differ in that some would be binary branching and others ternary branching. That just seems like an exceedingly unlikely kind of parametric difference. Of course, we need to end up with a theory that tells us what kind of parametric differences the language faculty allows.
That's super interesting, thank you. And I suppose, not to sort of ask you on this, but I suppose that would also link then if people spoke these different languages, how that would work for them with a flat structure versus a non-flat structure. It could get wildly complicated.
Well, I've never met such a person, but.
So I think this linked in a little bit from what you were saying, if I understood you correctly. So in linealizing these words, are we assuming a sort of lexicalism? And does it matter what the terminal nodes are taken to be? Does that impact anything?
Well, it certainly matters for our general attempt to understand the language faculty. On the other hand, the antisymmetry idea proper could be formulated in terms of morphemes or in terms of words. That is, I mean, you could, what I mean to say is that antisymmetry proper would be logically compatible with lexicalism. I mean, you could think in lexicalist terms that basically started out with words that were somehow composed in the lexicon, and then antisymmetry just comes into play in the syntactic area and doesn't see into words. I'm not sympathetic to that idea. In fact, already in the antisymmetry monograph, I argued that antisymmetry does see into words. And there's a very interesting precursor, distant precursor of that idea. If you look at one of Greenberg's universals, I forget what number, one of his universals establishes a link between the prefix-suffix difference cross-linguistically and the preposition-postposition difference cross-linguistically. So in establishing that kind of correlation, or in proposing it, or in advancing it, he was essentially saying that there's no sharp frontier between above word grammar and within word grammar. So I share with many people in the field now the anti-lexicalist idea that syntax manipulates morphemes, and that complex words are put together in a syntactic fashion, and that there's no and that there's no complex word put together in a lexicon distinct from syntax.
All right, thank you. And I think we're on our last question now, which is just what are the questions being asked about linearization, antisymmetry, being researched now that you think are going somewhere that you find most interesting?
Well, I think the most interesting question is the question whether or not antisymmetry is correct. Another interesting question is the question, I mean, if you take antisymmetry to be correct, you do have the question, does it hold sort of syntax internally the way I've taken it to hold? Or could you think of antisymmetry as holding of externalization, in the sense, could you agree with Chomsky and say that syntax constructs hierarchical structures? At a certain point, you externalize and you sort of transfer and you add linear order. It's certainly logically possible to take antisymmetry to be compatible with that view. In other words, you could say, yes, Chomsky's right about externalization. When you externalize, you impose linear order while respecting antisymmetry, while respecting a version of antisymmetry that doesn't require linear order to be part of core syntax. So there's a big question there. I mean, that part of the bigger question, that you started with, is linear order part of core syntax or not? And then, of course, there are all sorts of, more specific questions, like the disagreement between Cinque on the one hand and Abels and Neyleman on the other, concerning Cinque's 2005 linguistic inquiry paper on order within the DP. Cinque was sticking to a very rigid interpretation of antisymmetry. Abels and Neyleman wanted to suggest a weakened, a partially weakened version of antisymmetry. So, what is there to say about that? And if you think about that particular controversy, you get drawn into more general questions about cartography and questions about the cartographic, well, in particular, the cartographic view of DP structure. It's interesting that both Greenberg and Cinque, putting it slightly differently, Cinque followed Greenberg in setting aside the question of articles, definite articles and indefinite articles. So Greenberg's universals don't integrate them, and Cinque very explicitly leaves them out of his discussion. So there's a big question about how to integrate both definite and indefinite articles into this picture. Needless to say, both definite and indefinite articles raise all sorts of intricate questions of many different types.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's super, super interesting, and certainly raised a lot of thoughts for me. You may not know, so we work within a particular sort of LFG grammar in Oxford, so it's very exciting for us to hear about lots of things going on in the field that we might not have access to straight away in our classes. So thank you so much for spending some time and talking to us today. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me too.
Fantastic, brilliant. Yeah, so hopefully everybody watching this has really enjoyed it, because of course this will be going up before too long. So yeah, so just a big thank you from myself and Mal. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank both of you again.